T.I.A, right?
What is T.I.A?
This is Africa.
This is Africa with your host, Filmon Gebrselassie.
Hello and welcome to This is Africa, your weekly All Africa podcast. My name is Filmon Gebrselassie, and thank you for joining me this week. This week I had the privilege, honor, and quite frankly, I was amazed during an interview that I had with Eric Olander. Eric Olander is a veteran new media and broadcast journalist with over 25 years of experience in Asia, Africa, the US, as well as Europe. Over his expansive career in journalism, Eric has worked for the CNN, BBC World Service, the Associated Press, and France 24, where he served as the network's editor-in-chief of new media. Eric is currently based in Vietnam. He is the general director of Vietnam's all-business news channel, FBNC. Eric is fluent in both Mandarin and French, with a degree in East African history from the University of Berkeley and a master's degree in international public relations from the University of Hong Kong. In addition to all of that, he is also the co-host of a weekly podcast called China in Africa Podcast, which explores every aspect of growing Chinese engagement in Africa. You can find more about Eric at ericolander.com. about the China in Africa podcast at chinainafricaproject.com. All of this will be in the show notes. It was a pleasure interviewing Eric. I learned a ton, and I hope you do too as well. Enjoy. Can you take me to a few years ago when you made the decision to study East African history and why you did that?
Well, I was Actually, let me start over again. Okay, that was not the question I was expecting, actually.
It has a purpose. It has a purpose.
It's good. I started studying Chinese when I was about 15, and long before I got to college, I already worked in Taiwan. I worked in Hong Kong. Then I got to UC Berkeley, and I figured I was going to study the one thing that I would never ever study again and have the opportunity to work on again. And that's when you get to a school like Berkeley where you know the course catalog is like a phone book. And I just thought it was really exciting to go through, and I knew I was going to be involved in Chinese affairs for what I thought would be the rest of my life, and it actually turns out. But I never really imagined I would ever get involved in Africa. But there was one very, very important point that brought me to African studies. And that was when I was working in Hong Kong as a journalist when I was 20 years old before I went to Berkeley. And this was in just after 1989 when communism was falling all over Eastern Europe, all over the world. And yet it was also falling in parts of Africa. Right. And the way the media treated the fall of communism in Africa compared to the way it treated it in Europe, to me, was absolutely hypocritical. And there was a double standard there. Well, there was no treatment of it. And I just thought that was really very interesting for me. And so I thought that by studying Africa in college, I could learn about not necessarily just Africa, but also about the rest of the world. Given the fact that I was living in Hong Kong before I went to study, I was in a British colony, and I was curious about British colonialism in Africa, in Kenya, and in other parts of the continent. And so then all of these kind of pieces came together to study African history.
So in a way, you've come full circle, somewhat. By studying Africa and the relationship that it has with China. And what kind of drove you to study these two segments? Is it because of the education that you had and you thought that?
No, not at all. It really was something, more luck, and that's what happens in life. So my brother, Ben, he moved to Cameroon, and he was, a guy who was very, very successful in the first wave of the internet boom and was one of the leading designers for the first Star Wars website, the first Nike website. I mean, really did some pioneering graphic work and just got fed up with everything. And so he decided to quit after the boom bust. He decided to move to Cameroon, and he worked with a nonprofit group called VSO, Voluntary Services Organization, or VSO. And he's a filmmaker, and he's a designer, and he's a creative talent. And then so he started doing some documentaries in Cameroon, and then he moved to Kinshasa. And so he built a production company in Kinshasa, and this production company was doing a show called Rien que la vérité, Nothing But the Truth. It was a show sponsored at that time by the U.S. State Department through the PEPFAR program, which is the anti-AIDS program. It was an education program about AIDS, but not your typical kind of education program about AIDS. This was more like the Cosby Show, where there was morality messages intertwined into an excellent story. So this was a soap opera that he made, not, and it was a very different pioneering type of programming, and it was broadcast to a national Congolese audience. And by 2010, his company had grown so much that he invited me to come over to run the company for him in Kinshasa. Now, I had been going back and forth to see him in Kinshasa since 2005. And one of the most interesting things that I saw was in 2005, there was only one Chinese restaurant in Kinshasa. In fact, I even went there and got a picture of me in front of it because I thought, what a novelty, there's a Chinese restaurant in Kinshasa. Then by 2006, I went back. Few more Chinese there, but nothing that would really kind of, get your attention. But okay, you notice it, a little bit of a difference there. And then by 2007, it just ramps up big time. And you start seeing Chinese on the streets, Chinese planes, Chinese people on the planes, Chinese businesses are starting to open. 2008, 2009, and it's just mind-blowing, the way that the communities have changed. And so I saw something happening here. And in those 5 years of going back and forth to Kinshasa, and then in 2010 moving there, it was profound. And what I was seeing was a very different narrative on the ground than what I was reading in the international press. And it so annoyed me by reading the international press, which both described Africa in these very contrite, stereotypical type of caricatures, and then as well defining the Chinese in this very narrow type of story. And it just didn't reflect the nuance that was happening on the ground that I was seeing from, what people were doing, both from the Chinese side and from the Quinoa side, the Congolese side. And that was, to me, what was so fascinating was there was this big hole in the story. And I wanted to really tell that. Now, I came with a background of 20 years of China experience, living in China for almost 10 years, being a reporter there. I was an intern diplomat. I was a graduate student there. I mean, I did so many things in China. And bringing that into Kinshasa never occurred to me that I would ever use this type of background. But then when I saw this surging population and the surging type of engagement on all levels, from senior politicians to the guy on the street selling beignets, to how the local Quinoa were interacting with the Chinese, which again was far more nuanced than what we were seeing in the press.
Wow. So it's funny because when you think of the Congo and when coming from the Western perspective, just to expand on that a little bit, when you think of the Congo, all you think about is maybe if you know about him, Mobutu Sese Seko, and you think of the Congolese wars and child soldiers.
That's right.
But I bet you got a totally different perspective of what Congo is really like, perhaps?
Of course. And when you live anywhere, you get a totally different perspective.
Yeah.
And when you live, and what you've talked about are exactly what I call the embedded narratives, both of the Congo and of Africa as a whole. I mean, those overlap quite a bit. So if you're a journalist based in Kinshasa, you can pitch a story to London, New York, or any of the major capitals where your news organization's based. And if it doesn't involve rape, HIV, child soldiers, war, famine, UN camps, happy smiling children, we like that, famine, or again the happy African with their giraffes and wildlife, you're not going to get your story through. And that's really the big shortcoming here. That's not uniquely a Western bias, by the way. Yeah. In the Chinese press, it's just as bad. But also bear in mind, Africans are just as bad at this as well, and the Congolese. Everybody kind of is afflicted with this disease, which is these embedded narratives. People have their stereotypes of the other. And so when I read, some of the Kenyan press and the Congolese press, and every day I'm posting on Facebook, going through countless African media, they too are projecting stereotypes and caricatures as well, of both of themselves, but also of foreigners as well. So I'm not going to say this is uniquely a Western thing or an American thing. It just so happens that the American and Western press have a disproportionate influence on the rest of the global media. So I feel that their role is even more important. But again, this is it's endemic, and it's still chronic to this day.
I like the podcast that you had recently about profiling. I think maybe you could expand on it a little bit more, but not to take us too far off, but just about the fact that how the Chinese see Africans in China, and what that relationship is like. So basically, where I'd like to go is the fact that in 2006, I want to bring you back to that, and when I think of the relationship starting, I think of 2006 when, if you remember, the Chinese had invited 53 heads of state from Africa approximately, and they invited them in an effort to encourage investment, and it was a big media sort of event. So that's when I began noticing it. But like, would you say that marked the beginning of the modern era between the two sort of areas of the world, or the relationships?
Symbolically, maybe you can. This experiment that's been underway between the Chinese and Africans for the past 10 to 15 years. It was a gradual kind of buildup. Again, just like my experience in Kinshasa in 2005, I didn't see very much. Then all of a sudden, in 2010, the entire business class of the Air France flight from Paris to Kinshasa was Chinese. That was a buildup that took 5 years to get to that point, and we're still kind of seeing the ramp up right now. You can mark from a public policy point of view, an international relations point of view, that summit definitely was the kind of the marker, or one of the markers. The FOCAC summits, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which we're going to have another summit here in December in Johannesburg, that those summits have marked milestones as well. And that's where the Chinese bring out all of their big guns, all of their big diplomats, and the Africans kind of come in and reciprocate as well. So those are definitely markers in that sense. But the relationship is one that has really come out of nowhere very quickly. I define it in many ways a phenomena that is very much like the internet and technology, that these are uniquely 21st century phenomena. And one of the things that I've noticed, and I wrote a blog post back in 2011, I said, if you're under 40, you probably don't get the China-Africa relationship. If you're over 40, I'm sorry. If you're over 40, you probably don't get it. And the reason why is the people over 40, and I'm 45, were raised with educational systems that still looked at colonial Africa and read China. And these narratives that they had growing up of these kind of very kind of stereotypical views of both China and Africa are very hard to shake for people who are older. Wow. And so one of the things that I've noticed is that on our Facebook community, or when I talk to young Africans, is how much nuance they bring to the subject. How much detail. So on the one hand, you'll talk to a young Angolan and he'll say, that new hospital. I love the fact that they demine big parts of the countryside. I like the fact that there's new products in the market. So it's not a good or a bad. For them, it's just a whole lot of gray. And that to me...
So unfortunately, I lost Eric at this point. I do apologize. The Skype seemed to have cut out for a little bit. So again, I do apologize. But as you can tell, Eric is super knowledgeable. He knows so much about what's going on in that area, in that part of the world, and the relationship between the two. And as the podcast continues, it just gets better. So again, enjoy, folks. And I do apologize there.
Yeah. Oh, did we lose you, Dennis?
Okay,
Okay, pick up where you want to pick up.
Yeah, so just basically we were talking about the markers. So you would say I guess for people who are over 45 is what you were saying, they don't really understand, 40, they don't understand the relationship.
Well, oftentimes I find people over 40 don't understand it and have a more difficult time, much like I find older people struggle with technology and struggle with understanding the kind of way that technology is changing culture and the way that technology is changing politics and geopolitics. So I find that, this China-Africa relationship is very much a 21st century phenomenon. And you hear these older people kind of wanting to put this into a box that doesn't fit. This is neo-colonialism. It's an imperialism. And these are, again, uniquely pre-20th century types of phenomena. What the Chinese are doing in Africa has hints and tastes and spice of all of that, but it's none of it. And that's what makes it so very, very complicated and very, very interesting. Deborah Browdegim, who's the famous professor at Johns Hopkins University on Sino-African relations, she really equates the China-Africa relationship to the blind man and the elephant, that you can see anything you want in this relationship. If you want to say that China is the worst thing to happen to Africa, I can sit here for an hour and persuade you of that. If you want to say that China is the best thing that's ever happened to Africa, I can sit here for another hour and tell you that too. And so it opens up so much opportunity for people to try and define this relationship that is really, at this point, too complicated, too vast, too young to really define.
Okay, so I guess that brings me to trying to understand, because you're saying that it's difficult to understand. Well, it's complicated, I guess, is what the relationship is, which is it's an interesting way to put it. Because I mean, you're dealing with 53 different countries on the continent, as well as China itself. So I mean, I could understand how that'd be very complex. So what you're saying is very interesting to me. That there's a tendency to put the relationship into a box, neocolonialism, etc., that type of thing. So how would you describe all relationships with of the countries in Africa and their relationships with China? So would you say that some have better relationships, others have more of a adversarial? How would you describe?
No, I don't see of any of the countries in Africa. I have not seen an adversarial relationship emerge yet. Everybody looks to China at this point with a little bit of excitement, unease, confusion, apprehension, opportunity. And again, what you're kind of picking up on my theme here is that it's not a black or white thing. It's not, they don't look at China as saying it's good or it's bad. They don't look at China as being, a savior or a burden in any ways. I think a lot of African leaders are looking very strategically at China. Some, the kleptocrats, what Tom Burgess calls the looting machine, they look at China as the latest, way to make money. Certainly, the oil kleptocrats in Angola, certainly the Sudans, Zimbabwe, those are not countries that inspire an enormous amount of hope. Kobus, my podcast partner, he has this great saying, is that the Chinese will rise to the level, of whatever that country is. So therefore, in South Africa, for example, where there's a higher level of governance and a legal system that is more robust than, say, in other countries, the Chinese behave perfectly fine or better.
That's amazing.
But they will then go to countries which are more lawless, and they will adapt to that as well. So there is no single China in Africa, and there is no single Africa approach to dealing with China. There are countless different ways of doing it. I think it's very important also that when we talk about China and Africa, that we really define our terms here, because those are terrible descriptors of what we're talking about. First of all, the Chinese. Who are the Chinese in Africa? Now, when we think of the Chinese, we think of this monolithic type of group of people, oftentimes the government. We have this kind of communist state-run centralized system and this view, particularly in the West, of who the Chinese are, which is absolutely 100% wrong. The Chinese are an incredibly diverse, group in Africa. Some are the state, a lot of them are individuals. The 1 million to 2 million people that are there, the vast majority are independent. They're not there as part of some official delegation or whatnot. So the Chinese, we have to really be careful when we throw that word around, because it doesn't really describe very much. Just the same way that Africa and Africans doesn't describe very much in terms of as a word to the complexity and the variety and the diversity of Africa. So these are very difficult terms to kind of boil down. We use them as shorthand, but they're highly inaccurate.
I love your perspective, I have to say. It's so refreshing to get that perspective that it's complex. It's much more and over and beyond what we can actually explain it to be. It's you can't. Is that what you would say? Would you say you just can't?
You can't. But that's the same way. Again, I come back to the parallel with technology. Is technology good or is it bad? Well, I can argue that it's both. Right. I see what it's doing to my son when he watches YouTube and it makes him into a mushroom. But at the same time, it's amazing that he can watch YouTube and get Swedish videos. We're a Swedish family, and he gets to, watch, television and video from all over the world. I mean, it's good and bad at the same time. And so that's really how I see the parallel to the relationship, with the Chinese in Africa. My role is here in this whole discussion is that the debate over China-Africa, or the discussion about it, up until now, has been really dominated either by academics who are too wonky for the average person to kind of understand. And the academics, they're not writing for a mass audience. They're writing for each other. When they write and they publish for an academic journal, they don't expect or even want or care if the public kind of engages that content, at least, for the most part. Then you have the journalists, and the journalists themselves do a relatively crappy job at covering Africa and covering China. So, particularly when you put the two together. And now that's for a lot of complex reasons, not the fault entirely of the journalists themselves. Again, you have editorial desks that are driving the stories. I've been in journalism for 25 years. I know exactly how the system works. I've been a journalist in Europe, Asia, Africa, and North America. So I know exactly how it works. So part of the burden lies on the journalist who is not very well prepared for the topic, but part of it also lies in terms of what the Home Office will take as a story and what they think people want. And they guide their journalists on the ground to write that way. So I found that there was an opening in the middle to kind of be this link between, say, journalism, academia, social media, and also a style of talking and engaging the public that was more in sync with how people today are consuming media. In part, what I like to do is call out the hypocrisy on all sides, and in particular, the Americans, the Europeans, the Chinese, and the Africans themselves. And so my role on the podcast really is to be that one, is to be a little bit less polite. Cobus is a respected academic. He's very balanced, very mature, very thoughtful. I try to be the opposite of that in some respects. But to call BS when BS deserves to be called. And that's whether it's the Americans who preach a democracy agenda and criticize the Chinese for supporting dictators, and Washington is doing exactly the same thing. When the Europeans accuse, particularly French and British, the Chinese of neocolonial behavior, and then you ask the question of who started 3 wars in the past 5 years in Africa, and it's not the Chinese. So, these are the questions that need to be kind of confronted in a very cold type of reality. I'm not saying that I'm always right, but I am trying to challenge what I think is this bold hypocrisy when it comes to Africa that too many have.
Oh, okay. So how would you describe what worries you about the relationship, if anything? And then could you expand on sort of the Chinese diplomacy in Africa, and are they using a lot of soft power? That's from my perspective, it seems like it's a lot of soft power that they're using, but it seems like they're using a lot of bargaining chips as well. Yeah. So
let's talk about some of the concerns. And the concerns are real, and the concerns are scary. And vast. So let's start on just the scale of China's engagement. What worries me the most is the fact that China is not going to be a colonial power in Africa. Let's just kind of put that out there. It will not be a neo-colonial power in Africa, because that's a complete misreading of what colonialism was. In that colonialism was an all-encompassing system where the administrative system, the educational system, religion, culture, trade, every part of it was brought under the control of one country. And that's not what the Chinese are doing. The Chinese, if anything, are mercantilists in Africa. Mm. And that has hints of imperialism. You can definitely draw some very thin lines to an imperialist type of approach, but it's mercantilism. This is about money and commerce. That's primarily. What concerns me is when we see very small countries like Ghana taking on massive amounts of debt from China. That's a worry. And this is why I think, if anything, you want to draw a comparison to a prior mode from history, a prior political mode. China does not have an imperial history. China does not have a colonial history. In fact, China itself was the victim of colonialism. And this is something that comes to a surprise to many Africans. They are unaware that the British, the French, the Germans, even the Americans and the Japanese colonized parts of China. And that in some ways what China tries to leverage as a way to bond with many Africans, say, you were the victims of colonialism, we were the victims of colonialism, from the same people, by the way, so we have something in common. It's a shared type of suffering. The Chinese do play that quite a bit, and to some effect as well. But the Chinese themselves were never a colonial power, but they were a tributary power. And what that means is I'm sitting here in Vietnam, which for 1,000 years was run by the Chinese. And they ran it not through armed or force, but they ran it, which they did in part, absolutely. But they ran it also through a tributary state where the the emperor of Vietnam had to go up to Beijing to kowtow, pay the respects, pay the money, and then China would say, okay, you are in our good standing. We will not kind of hold you, hostage. So what I worry a little bit about is that we're creating new tributary states in Africa, and that the Chinese will have so much disproportionate power over these smaller countries by virtue of the fact that they've loaned so much money that will compromise the sovereignty of these small African states. Even Angola, President Jose Eduardo dos Santos is in Beijing, right now with cap in hand because oil prices are depressed for a prolonged period of time. He's taken on $20 billion of loans from the Chinese. He's asking them to defray the interest on those. He's now asking to diversify away from oil. And this is the type of issues that I'm worried about, the direction that it's going. And you see these very poorly run states and legislatures like in Uganda, which are just frittering away so much of the Chinese aid money and the Chinese development money and the Chinese investment money. And there I worry that the debts just pile up. And we go back to where we were in the 80s when Africans were saddled with billions and billions of dollars of Cold War debt that they couldn't pay off. Right. Now, in this case, the Chinese have been rather unforgiving in recent history about forgiving debt. They're very, very generous. Please, let's not confuse, the generosity of aid and some of the development money. Some figures put it up as high as $75 billion. But again, going back to Deborah Browdegum here, who's this professor out of Johns Hopkins, it's very, very difficult to parse what money from the China is aid, what is investment, what is loan. A lot of that is very, very complicated because the process is very opaque. We don't get to see behind the curtain as to what's actually going on. So there is a concern that the Chinese will be very, very disciplined in not accepting the Africans to renegotiate this debt, low interest as it may be. It is still debt that needs to be repaid. And that could potentially compromise African sovereignty and put us back to a very dark place where we were in 20, 30 years ago when African sovereignty was compromised both by colonialism but also by debt. So that's one very big concern. The other very big concern is the mechanization of resource extraction. One of the differences between the Chinese and, say, the Belgians, the French, the British, when they were exploiting Africa for its natural resources, is it was nowhere near as mechanized as it is today. And so what the Chinese have done is if you go all throughout Africa, you'll see Chinese construction equipment, Chinese resource extraction equipment. This is and it's remarkable. The speed with which they can cut down forests now, the speed with which that elephants can be killed, the speed with which mines can be emptied is remarkable. And that's just a consequence of globalization, of modern technology, and the Chinese are leveraging that. Not just the Chinese, I should point out, others as well. But I worry in part, again, when we talk about Kobus's theory that the Chinese will rise to the level of governance in places like the Republic of Congo, where there's an enormous amount of corruption in the national parks. The Chinese are aggressively cutting vast parts of that rainforest down to ship back for timber to China. And that worries me as well on an environmental basis. So the Chinese don't have very strong environmental governance of their own, and they certainly don't export that in any way, not just in Africa, but other parts of the world. So there's another concern there. So I could go on for quite some time about the concerns. As I pointed out, I can convince you that China is the worst thing for Africa. It really is. But conversely, I can also tell you it's the best thing.
Right. I guess it just depends on the administration of that country.
It does. And it does. I mean, Joseph Kabila in the DR Congo, is an asshole of the highest degree. Has no regard whatsoever for the welfare and well-being of his people, and pockets hundreds of millions of dollars in Chinese loans, in Chinese bribes. It's believed, Africa Confidential estimated that from the Sicko Mines deal alone, Kabila took in $300 million from the Chinese. So, these are despicable people, by any definition. And the Chinese kind of feed into that because they're incredibly pragmatic.
Of course.
However, let me be very, very clear here. that the Chinese are by no means alone or unique in this game.
Exactly.
Kabila has been incredibly adept at playing all of the different parties off of each other. And may I remind everybody, before the West gets very high and mighty, that the Citibank building in Kinshasa is the longest standing building in downtown Kinshasa. Why? Because I'm convinced that Citibank is the vehicle that the Kabila family uses to move their money in and out of Kinshasa. So let's not get high and mighty when we look at HSBC and Citibank and some of these other organizations that operate with the implicit or explicit consent of their governments. Everybody's to blame in this.
Right.
The Chinese are just the latest actor in this.
Right, exactly. They're new on the stage, yeah. So is you mentioned the fact that they're mercantilists. So is the relationship is the relationship just a way for the Chinese to get goods into the continent, or like do the Africans also have the ability to sell goods other than wheat?
No, absolutely. This is something that's very interesting. So the Chinese first and foremost see the Africa relationship as an economic relationship. Definitely, I think and there's consensus among the academics and scholars and experts that that probably the majority of the weight of this relationship is tied to both extracting raw materials, but also to provide opportunities for Chinese companies and manufacturers in Africa, just as they are in other emerging markets around the world, like here in Vietnam. So it's a bilateral economic relationship. That is, I'd say, first and foremost. However, it's to simply define it as a purely economic relationship is missing a lot of the other aspects of it. It's increasingly becoming a military relationship. The Chinese are reported to be interested in building a military base in Djibouti. And that would be because Djibouti is strategically located close to the Persian Gulf, but also towards the Indian Ocean, which they're building this One Belt, One Road, which is a global kind of supply chain to bring raw materials back into China. And those Indian Ocean sea lanes are going to be absolutely critical. So the Chinese Navy now has been participating in multinational anti-piracy operations off the coast of Somalia for some 3 or 4 years, really using that as a training ground for far-off deployment of the Navy. The Navy was doing exercises in the Mediterranean as well, so we're seeing that. The Chinese Navy last year did an 8-nation tour throughout Africa to kind of go to Cape Town, Namibia, and a number of other locations as well to show a presence. Please don't forget that China has more UN peacekeepers on the continent now than any other permanent member of the UN Security Council. So they are playing an instrumental role in the fight against Ebola, in stabilization operations in Mali, post-conflict there. So military is also a big part of it. Diplomacy is another aspect of this relationship that's critical. Africa may be relatively poor, 1% of global manufacturing, but at the same time, each state is a member of the United Nations, many of them are member of the Criminal Court, many are members of other world bodies, and China sees itself as a kind of developing world emerging market leader in many respects. And so it will go to fight in the International Criminal Court to defend Uhuru Kenyatta, against charges that he was, charged for, human rights violations. They will go to fight for African interests on the Security Council of the United Nations. So this is a diplomatic issue as much as anything else. Still relatively small, but still vitally important. And that's, again, another question about all this money coming in. Does it make African states somehow beholden to China in some of these diplomatic fora as well? So imagine the conversations that the Chinese UN ambassador might have with the Ghanaian ambassador if Ghana wants to support Tibet, or wants to support Taiwan, or wants to support the United States in an issue against China. That might be a rather awkward conversation. So all of this ties into diplomacy as well. And again, I keep coming back to the fact that, again, you hear this theme that it's complex, it's broad, it's vast, and it doesn't fit into a simple narrative.
Fair enough. So the positives. I don't think. Great. Yeah, like I know that we're talking about it. You're bringing up so many interesting and very complex topics, but like, what would you specifically say is
the positives are exciting? I mean, the positives are very, very exciting. And the positives in many ways. Let's start with the one that I like the most. That when I go to Africa and when I was living in Kinshasa, I was on a Huawei 3G modem connected to a Huawei cell tower connected to, that was probably, to fiber lines put in by the Chinese as well.
These are all Chinese products, yeah.
It's all Chinese products, but it's Chinese infrastructure as well.
Right, yeah.
And that mobile infrastructure, that data networks, and I think the Chinese deserve enormous amounts of credit for wiring Africa up and for bringing telecom to Africa, both in the private sector, which is companies like Huawei, ZTE, who are selling low-cost cell phones, which are really targeted for emerging markets like Africa. Again, there are a lot of parallels to what we see here in Vietnam, these sub-$100, these $50, $60 Android smartphones that are coming in. Those are remarkable at what they can do for people. The infrastructure, roads, bridges, power stations, all of this is desperately needed. Africa has $1 trillion need for infrastructure. The Chinese $1 trillion of infrastructure is needed in Africa, and the Chinese are the only ones who are bringing in this kind of money to build. Now, not all of the infrastructure they're building is of high quality. Not all of it is actually very good, and that really depends country by country, project by project. It's not fair or accurate to kind of paint a broad brush about Chinese infrastructure in Africa. But a lot of it, what we can't dispute is how badly needed it is, particularly in the areas of power generation. Having stable supplies of electricity is absolutely vital. And these are things that the West doesn't value as much anymore. We keep talking about in the West, democracy and civil rights and freedom of religion, association, whatnot. And people in places across much of Africa are desperate for infrastructure. So what they've done there is absolutely remarkable. The other most important thing, what I think they've done, is they're giving African leaders and African societies choice. Too much, even in the post-colonial era, of African policymaking was either controlled, influenced, or directed by the West or the former colonial powers. And the Chinese have come in and completely shaken up the system. They have completely, shattered the illusion that the IMF and the World Bank were the only choices, and that structural adjustment was something that African governments had to accept or else. And now they've got a choice. They've got an ally in many respects who will listen to them much more as equals rather than this paternalistic relationship that has gone on for too long. I mean, even look at President Obama in his, Africa summit that he had. He didn't do one-on-one meetings. He took them as groups.
Right.
And to me, if you're President Goodluck Jonathan of Nigeria, the largest economy in Africa, and you're sitting with a group of 4 other leaders, how disrespectful is that?
You want to be noticed, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and the point is that the Chinese afford African governments respect. And I think this is very, very important, that when the Togolese commerce minister travels to Beijing, he meets with the commerce minister of China. He gets the time. And when these ministers from these smaller, rather insignificant countries geopolitically travel to Paris, to London, to Washington, they don't get that kind of attention. How many ministers and heads of state, and prime ministers and the head of state, how often are they traveling constantly from China into Africa? And this is something that when Obama travels to Africa, it's a huge deal because he doesn't do it very often. But either the prime minister or the president of China go at least once a year. And that is something that's remarkable. And that is something that's given, to me, brought self-esteem that says, particularly for Africa to say, this matters, you matter, this market is important. And the fact that I don't know if you can draw a straight line, the coincidence that African economies have surged, many of them have taken off in the same period of time that the Chinese have engaged Africa. Exactly. I think there's a connection.
It has to be.
You would think, but it's hard to kind of draw that line. But $200 billion of trade between China and Africa has got to have an effect.
It went from 20 billion, I think, 20 years prior. 20 billion to 200 in like a matter of 15, 20 years?
Yeah. I mean, and it's absolutely remarkable. Yeah. Now, on the personal and the individual level, this is something, again, this is what I call the Walmart reaction. So I come from Berkeley, California, a snooty, liberal, very affluent community in the United States, where people tell you, I would never shop at Walmart. It's disgusting.
Tell us more.
It's disgusting. And they have this kind of attitude. And yet you go to where the customers that Walmart serves in the United States, largely it's the working poor. And what the working poor have such an affinity for Walmart and an affection for Walmart, in part because it's allowed them to have their disposable income go so much farther, to enjoy many of the luxuries that we in the upper middle class have taken for granted. And so I look at Walmart as being, again, like China, both a mixture of good and bad. And this Walmart effect is also happening in Africa. What the Chinese are doing is across the continent, small entrepreneurs are bringing in huge amounts of low-cost crap. We're talking plastic headphones, shoes, clothes, toys, whatever it is. And what it does is, I've seen this in Kinshasa. These little kind of bodegas open up, and they give people with virtually no disposable income an opportunity to buy their child a toy, to get some new shoes, now it's poorly made, but at the end of the day, it's exciting for people to have that consumer choice. And so that, to me, is something that's very important. There's a flip side to this. The Chinese have brought in huge amounts of textiles into Africa, lowering the price of textiles for all African consumers. Very important, particularly for people with very, very limited incomes, that they can now spend more. They can buy a cell phone that they could never have bought, 5 years ago. They can get shoes and all these other things. The flip side of this is it's having a devastating effect on the Egyptian apparel industry, in North Nigerian Kano State, on the textile and apparel industries there as well. So there's good and bad. For the suppliers and the manufacturers in Africa, they're suffering. For the consumers, they're benefiting enormously with new product choice and new availabilities of technologies. And I think that's very, very exciting.
So that becomes an interesting issue and concern, because as the consumer becomes more aware of the realities around him or her, they might eventually say, there are too many products. We have to begin developing or creating our own products, and maybe that could lead to I'm stretching.
That's wishful thinking.
Is that wishful thinking?
That's absolutely wishful thinking, because creating your own products, requires an infrastructure, requires a supply chain, requires expertise. Industrial engineers. It requires a whole bunch of things, more than just cheap labor. A lot of people who come to this issue say, well, Africa can make its own cell phone or make its own, shoe manufacturing system. Yeah, you can, absolutely. But you also need an enormous amount of things that the Chinese have spent the past 25 years building up. And if you consider the fact that, of the world's 13 billion pairs of shoes that are made every year, 12 billion are made in China. Okay, and the reason why they do that is because the ports, the roads, the supply chains, the infrastructure is all there for manufacturing. And Africa still struggles with consistent electric supplies. So if you're going to build a giant factory and manufacturing operation and your power goes down for 2 hours in the afternoon, that's not acceptable for a manufacturer. So that's why I say it's wishful thinking. It's happening in pockets. Ethiopia, I think, is the most. Ethiopia is probably the best example of this, but we cannot extract, one case study from Ethiopia across the entire continent. And I always love these stories of made in China is now made in Africa, and they focus on the same Huajin shoe factory in Ethiopia, and they say, Ethiopia is Africa, Huajin is China, and it's just ridiculous. So that's the crappy reporting that frustrates me.
Fair enough. Okay. Yeah. Mainly, I had heard about, the fact that they're building that massive dam. And obviously that means that they're
building a lot of dams, by the way, not just one. They're building a lot. Damming is a big thing.
Okay. As from what I knew, or from what I know, the Renaissance Dam was supposed to be, the one that galvanized the population behind this massive project and pushing Ethiopia forward. And so from the way I saw it, tell me if I'm wrong, that Ethiopia was trying to become a new manufacturing hub within the continent, and that relationship with China would kind of push that forward.
Absolutely. Ethiopia. So the Renaissance Dam is one that's very interesting because it's incredibly sensitive. Any dams, are one of these topics that love them or hate them. Environmentalists hate them, understandably so because they cause devastating, environmental consequences. Economists love them in many respects because a steady supply of electricity that dams provide is something that all economies need. And the Renaissance Dam certainly provides that. To be fair here, the Chinese are not building the Renaissance Dam. They're actually one of many financial partners in that project. So we don't want to give them the full credit for that. I think they're just actually a financing. I'm not even sure they're doing the construction on the Renaissance Dam.
As far as I, yeah.
Do you have any information that's different than that?
Well, I do know that there are 8,000 Ethiopian workers there, there might be some other Chinese, etc. But I do know also that the Ethiopian government has asked its population actually to give some of their salaries, and if they're working in the bureaucracy, some of them have given up to 2 months of salary.
Ask is probably the wrong word. More likely in Ethiopia, the Ethiopian government is not known for its politeness and asking its people to do things. So. But you can see it's an issue of national importance, and Ethiopia really sees the opportunity to become a manufacturing center. It's got a certain climate that is good for obviously it's got great leather supplies, so that's very important for certain types of apparel. It's got a very good strategic location, easy access to both the rest of the continent by ship, but also into Europe and the major ports into the Middle East. So there's a good geopolitical and geostrategic location and reasons for it to do it. The bigger question about Ethiopia and its ability to do this is that it's got a political system that is, how should I put it? I mean, they've got the lowest cell phone penetration in the continent. They've got, they're locking up their dissidents. And these political systems that are so repressive oftentimes, to me, don't necessarily go hand in hand with economic development. That said, ironically, the Chinese themselves, who are not known as being the most open people in the world, have done exceptionally well. And so they look to the Chinese in many ways as a model of retaining authoritarian, totalitarian control, more authoritarian control, and at the same time driving economic growth and development. So Ethiopia is an interesting case. In many ways, Ethiopia is distinct from the rest of the continent in its characteristics in terms of how it's dealing with the Chinese, because it's not an oil and it doesn't have as much natural resources. What it's got is location. It's got a political system that's more amenable to the Chinese. It's also the home of the African Union, so it's got a diplomatic role that the Chinese value. The Chinese built the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa.
As a gift.
So as a quote-unquote gift.
Quote-unquote. Yes.
There are no gifts in life, is what I've learned. Especially
Eric.
$200 million gifts. Nothing is free.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Nothing is free in this life. So the point is that, Ethiopia is rather interesting. But at the same time, it highlights what I said at the beginning of the show, which is each country has its own characteristics in its relationship with China. And it's very difficult to extrapolate broad trends across the continent because of the variety and the diversity that exists.
Okay. So that brings me to this question that I had from someone who listens and a friend of mine, actually. She had been living in Africa, in Ghana, as well as in Ethiopia. And her question was, why is it that they don't employ more local workers?
So this is
what is the relationship there?
This is really one of the myths about the Chinese in Africa. And it is, for some reason, it just sticks. I mean, it is like glue. And so I just did a show with professors Yen Hairong and Barry Sautman, who are two of probably the best scholars and experts on Chinese labor in Africa. They're out of Hong Kong. And they went and they did an exhaustive study up and down the continent, surveying hundreds and hundreds of sites. I mean, really the most exhaustive academic study on labor, on Chinese labor in Africa. And what they came up with is that, number one, the Chinese hire majority local labor. This myth that the Chinese are bringing over, all of the labor is rather remarkable. And it is absolutely a myth. And so on our website, if you look at the ChinaAfricaProject.com, you can go ahead and you can find the link to Barry Sautman and Yen Hairong's study. Number two, there is a myth that the Chinese disproportionately hire more Chinese compared to other foreign enterprises in Africa. And that's not true. The Chinese bring over largely their engineering and technical talent. They do bring over some labor. There is actually, there's no disputing that they bring over some labor. But What's interesting about the way they bring over some labor is that oftentimes that labor is brought over in small numbers in order to kickstart and jumpstart projects and to do the jobs that they feel that locals cannot do. And one cannot underestimate how difficult it is to operate in countries and cultures where you don't speak the language, you don't know the culture, you don't know the environment, and yet you're under enormous deadline pressures to get projects complete. Oftentimes, those projects are set by the host governments. So there is no pan-African type of project management. It's country by country, project by project. The point is, I really encourage people to look at this Barry Sautman study and Yen Hairong, Sautman, Sautman.
Yeah.
And it really diffuses a lot of these myths about Chinese labor. And one of the things that people are doing is they're conflating a lot of different issues. It's hard for people who don't understand the Chinese to differentiate between, an engineer for Huawei and a laborer, because they oftentimes look very similar. That engineer who's putting up that cell phone tower, who's got a master's of electrical engineering, will sleep in the same crappy type of environment as a worker. No joke. And that's often confused. A lot of people will say, why do the Chinese export prison labor to Africa? That's another one that's very strong. And there's been absolutely no evidence whatsoever that the Chinese are exporting prison labor. And yet you'll ask people, you say, okay, well, let's use the logic of that. Why in God's name would the Chinese export prison labor when there is a surplus of labor that they can export anyway? Okay, because prisoners are not known to be the most efficient workers always. But one of the reasons why that people, particularly locals, have this perception that the Chinese export prison labor to Africa is because the Chinese camps that these men, that they have, the construction, they put barbed wire up, they put guard towers up. And now in the Chinese mindset, that's designed to keep the people on the outside from coming in and stealing stuff. The people on the outside, they say, well, wait, they have nothing to be afraid of us. They must be trying to keep people on the inside from trying to get out. And so you have a very big misunderstanding that happens quite a bit here. But there are Deborah Browdegem, Barry Sautman, Solange Chadala, all of these scholars and these experts have looked up and down the continent for evidence of prison labor. There is none. The facts do not support the idea that the Chinese import more labor than other countries do to do work. There's definitely some, but it is a misperception to think that the Chinese do not hire locals. And that's not true. That's not supported by the facts.
So if you could relay one message to listeners or people generally, or not one message, but a message about the relationship, what would your message be? What would you try to dispel, other than we've gone over the fact that it's a complex relationship. So what else would you want to mention about the relationship between the two?
This is, in my view, and the reason why I'm so passionate about it is because it is an endlessly fascinating topic. Good, bad, everything in between. But it's one of the most important geopolitical relationships in the 21st century. So the most important geopolitical relationship in the 21st century is the United States and China. The world's number one and number two economies, the world's number one and number two polluters, the world's number one and number two navies, militaries. On so many different ways, the United States and China are by far the most important geopolitical relationship. But China's engagement with both Africa and South America are incredibly important because they are changing the international landscape right in front of our eyes. The tectonic plates that have been in place for the past 50 to 60 years are moving now for the first time. This idea that the World Bank, the IMF, and Washington, London, and Paris control the levers of power in the global stage is breaking down. The BRICS Bank that's coming up, the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that's coming up, the amounts of money that the Chinese are bringing to Africa, the military engagement that they're doing, cultural, diplomacy, economics, all of it really highlight in so many ways the key trends of emerging 21st century diplomacy. And that's why this is such a fascinating and significant topic for everybody to follow, because the consequences will be felt far beyond Africa or China, but we are finding it in terms of the United States and its role in the world. How is the United States, supposed guarantor of global peace, engaging Africa when most Africans now in positions of power look to the United States with a certain degree of frustration? And this idea that the United States represents, the ideal of politics is fading now because the Chinese are bringing an economic model to Africa that in many ways is a better fit for Africans. And that, democracy and capitalism have been tried in Africa with very little effect for the past 50 years. And now this authoritarian capitalism is coming in, and people like Paul Kagame in Rwanda are saying, yep, sign me up for that. Mm-hmm. And there is a war of ideas that's going on. And this war of ideas, the Americans naively think that in the end of the Cold War, they won the war of ideas, that capitalism over communism. And so Americans, for the most part, have stopped kind of engaging the rest of the world on this. But this war is being fought in places like South Asia, Africa, South America, where three competing kind of structures are going up against each other. It's the liberal capitalism of the international order, the Washington consensus, if you will. Then there is the Chinese state-run capitalism, and then there's religious extremism, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram. All three of these are battling with one another in Africa. And who is going to emerge, we don't know yet. Certainly in parts of West Africa, the religious extremism, and in Mali, in Nigeria, in Libya, is taking hold and very, very compelling. Rwanda doing an excellent job with state authoritarianism. Other parts of Africa, particularly, I'm trying to think of where liberal capitalism is actually doing very well. Not really, actually. But the point is that these ideas are battling around, and the Americans are not that engaged in this fight, whereas Chinese absolutely are. And to me, that's a very, very interesting discussion to follow as well. And the last point that I'll make is that this is an opportunity, as I said earlier, to challenge both your own country and your own consumer behavior, but others as well on the hypocrisy that has defined Africa for so long. And really what I enjoy the most is we have a choice now that we did not have 20 years ago, where China comes in with an alternate system to say, wait a minute, you're doing the same thing. Not to excuse or justify or rationalize what the Chinese are doing, but to put it in a proper context.
Amazing. So what are you working on next? What's your next show going to be about? What are you excited for? What's coming up?
A couple things we're doing right now is we're working with Wits University in Johannesburg to create a journalist training program for the upcoming FOCAC Summit. That's the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in December. And so we're going to create kind of some podcasts, some Google Plus Hangouts, all for journalists who are going to be coming from other parts of the world to cover this, who may not be very well versed in the issue. So that's something we're very excited that we're working on. Cobus and I are also developing a curriculum on China-Africa using social media, both for for high school and for university as well, because we just don't feel that the universities are teaching this very well. So we're going to be creating curricula for that. Coming up in our next show, we're talking about, and this will be by the time your show is published, we'll probably have ours up as well, so you can check it out. We're talking about the latest deal between the South Africans and the Chinese, which are coming much closer together, over information communication technology, and how the Chinese are giving an enormous amount of support to South Africa to develop privacy, cybersecurity, all these different ICT tools, which are going to be very interesting. But the Democratic Alliance, the largest opposition party in South Africa, is kind of pissed off about it, and so they're fighting back. So we'll be talking about that in our next episode.
Amazing. So Eric, as my first guest on the show, I really appreciate you coming on, discussing the topic that we just went over. You've been such a valued guest on the show, and really expanded, at least for me, my horizons on what the relationship is really about, and giving me some new things to think about as well. So thank you for doing that.
It is my honor to be your first guest. I hope it only gets better from here.
Wow. So I don't know about you, but I just learned a ton of information. I'm going to take that and dissect it very slowly, try to understand it to the fullest that I can. If you have any thoughts on what you just learned, or if you want to discuss it further, please send me an email. Let me know your thoughts and what you might have thought as well. And you can send that to thisisafricapodcast@gmail.com, or you can post it on our Facebook page, This is Africa Podcast. Just search us up on Facebook and you'll find us. Again, all the details with regards to this podcasts are in the show notes. So anything that Eric had referred to with regards to any studies, you'll find those details in the show notes. Please follow Eric's podcast. It's extremely informative. You'll learn a ton. Thanks for joining me this week, and I'll see you in the next one, folks. Have a good week.